Hi everyone. Again, I'm Nicole, and today we're going to be picking up where we left off yesterday in Nancy Drew and the Bike Tour Mystery, beginning with Chapter 5, No Thanks. Bob Prendergast came hurrying out the door right behind Nancy. Go ask the pub owner for some ice, and have him call a doctor, he said, kneeling beside Rachel. His fingers gently probed the side of her forehead, where Nancy could see a small bloody gash, and send Terry out. Here already, Bob, came Terry's voice from the shadows beside the pub door. Nancy turned to look at him, standing with his hands thrust in the pockets of his baggy corduroys. How had he arrived so fast and so silently, Nancy wondered. Had he come from inside, or was he outside the whole time? Fetch the first aid kit from the van, Terry, Bob said, not looking up. Nancy hated to leave the scene of the accident, but she knew it was crucial to get medical help as soon as possible. Luckily, the pub owner had heard the commotion and was already at the doorway. He promised to bring out some ice as soon as he had phoned a physician. There's no one directly in town, he warned Nancy. Doom was not so big as all that. But Dr. Finney lives only a couple miles off. I'll ring him up. Bess and George joined Nancy as she headed back outside. Rachel's been knocked out. It looks like the pub sign fell and hit her in the head, she said anxiously. Derek was inside the whole time. I know, I was watching him, Bess said, reading Nancy's mind, just in case you were wondering. As they emerged again into the clear, crisp night air, Nancy was relieved to see Rachel beginning to moan and stir. My head, Rachel murmured. Wicked pain. Her eyes fluttered open and then squeezed shut again, as if even the dim light from the pub door was too bright. A curious crowd had begun to spill out of the doorway. Rhonda pushed her way through, glaring. Can't you all clear off? She snapped. Yes, that's enough now, you lot, the pub owner said. Handing a bag of ice to Nancy, he shooed the gawkers back inside. Bess and George reluctantly followed them. Rhonda bent over Rachel. What were you thinking of? She scolded her sister. Why did you go outside? You know you shouldn't slip off on your own. Rachel winced. Leave off, Ron, she replied groggily. Gotta have a life. Where does it hurt, Rachel? Bob asked. Rachel lifted a hand weakly and touched the top of her skull on the right side. Something heavy, out of nowhere. Rhonda glimpsed the blood on her sister's forehead and sucked in her breath. The sign. It really hit you. Give us that ice, Nancy. She started to lift Rachel's head, but Bob stopped her. Best not to move her in case she's had a concussion, he suggested. Lay the ice against her head from the side and wait for the doctor. No doctor! Rachel burst out with surprising vehemence. I'm all right. She pushed herself up onto her elbows with a sudden, forceful effort. Now, Rachel, it's best to get checked out, Bob said. With head injuries, you never know. Then send the doctor to the hotel, Rachel declared. I'm not lying here in the gutter anymore. Help me up, Ron. Rhonda took her sister's elbow and helped her to her feet. We'll be all right, Bob, she said. She cast a worried look up and down the shadowy street. I'll see she stays in bed. Send the doctor along. Nancy noted Bob's anxious expression. I could have Terry drive you in the van, he offered. He should be back any sec. He glanced around, just realizing that Terry hadn't returned. No, Rhonda insisted. She quickly added, I'll walk her back. It's not far. Fresh air might do her good, better than being jolted in a van. I'll be fine, Rachel announced, lifting her chin as she took a wobbly first step. Not to worry. Bob stepped back, hands hanging helplessly at his sides. Nancy stood with him, watching as the sisters moved tentatively down the sloping street toward the inn where the Rube was staying. An only child herself, Nancy didn't always understand sibling relationships, but she knew enough to see that this one was complicated indeed. Jim Nafusco popped out of the front door. Is Rachel okay? He asked. We heard she was hurt, but we didn't want to hover. I'll go reassure everyone, Bob said. Nancy, tell Terry I'm inside, and don't stay out too long. The night air is cold so close to the sea. He ducked back inside the pub. What happened? Jim asked Nancy. She pointed to the wood sign on the pavement. Apparently that fell and clonked Rachel on the side of the head. Jim knelt to inspect the thick slab of wood, carved in the shape of a wicker-framed one-man boat. So that's what the pub's named after. A crock fishing boat, he said. He ran his hands over the wood. Nice carving, real craftsmanship. This makes 2 accidents in a row, Nancy remarked. Rhonda passed out last night, now this with Rachel, if it was an accident. With a professional eye, Jim studied the end of one of the chains from which the sign had hung. Hard to tell how it happened. This chain link is twisted like it had torn loose. Maybe the other side was rusted. He picked up its mate, then gave a low whistle. No, this one's been cut clean through, like someone hacked it with a saw. Let me see. Nancy bent down to to examine the two chains. So once this chain was severed, the other one would eventually break, Jim replied. It couldn't hold the weight on its own. These chains are pretty thin to carry such a heavy sign. If I'd hung it, I'd have used a thicker chain. Nancy looked solemnly at Jim. So possibly someone meant for Rachel to get hurt. Jim screwed his mouth to the side. Maybe. I'd sure like to know why the one chain was cut. So would I, Nancy said grimly. She swiveled and began to hunt around the pavement. If she could find a discarded hacksaw or even a pile of iron shavings. Her eyes fell on a patch of white on the ground, right where Rachel had fallen. She stooped to pick it up. On a crumpled piece of paper was scrawled, R. Meet me outside. D. Nancy chewed her lip. Who had written this note? Someone whose name started with D. Derek Thorogood? He had been sitting at the table with Rachel, Nancy remembered. Why had he needed to see her privately? She turned to face Jim. We shall let Bob know what we found, she said. I'll go to the inn and talk to Rachel and Rhonda. Jim nodded and went back inside. Drawing a steadying breath, Nancy headed down the street toward their inn. She fingered the corner of the note in her pocket. Think logically, she reminded herself, like her father had always told her. Don't make quick assumptions. For instance, why assume the note was for Rachel? R could just as easily stand for Rhonda. Either girl might have dropped it when she came outside tonight. The note might have nothing to do with the accident, Nancy mused. But still, it was worth checking out. It was no more puzzling than the other facts in this case so far. The lilt of music-making coursed through the evening air, only the tune changing as Nancy passed each of the village's pub in turn. But she was thinking too hard to notice. Reaching the inn, Nancy marched past the front desk and straight upstairs. With its whitewashed walls and polished plank floors, the inn was more rustic than last night's lodging, but it was cozy and quiet. The Selkirk's room was at the end of the third-floor hallway. Nancy rapped on their door. Who is it? Rhonda called. Nancy Drew, I have to talk to you. After a brief silence, Rhonda called back. Another time, Nancy. Rachel needs to sleep. If she's had a concussion, she should stay awake, Nancy warned. Are her pupils dilated? Go away, Rhonda replied. Then Nancy heard Rachel's low murmur. A moment later, the door opened. Rachel faced her. Come on in, Nancy, she said. I'm feeling groggy, I must admit, but we can talk. Nancy glanced at Rachel's pupils, which she was glad to see were normal sized. How many fingers? She asked, holding up 3 fingers. I already did all those tests, Rhonda said, leafing through a magazine on the bed. And it's not like you're a doctor, Nancy. No, I'm no doctor, Nancy admitted. She paused, making certain of her own decision. But I am a detective, she revealed. Rachel's eyes widened. Rhonda slapped shut her magazine. For real? Rachel asked. Nancy nodded. I'm just an amateur, but I've solved lots of cases. No one on the trip knows except Bess and George. But I think you need someone to look out for you. Knowing my background, will you let me help? Rachel fidgeted. Thanks, but no thanks, Nancy. It's sweet of you to offer, but we don't need protection. Those were 2 random accidents. Nancy raised her eyebrows. That falling sign may not have been an accident, she said. She told them what she and Jim had discovered. Rhonda snorted. That's ridiculous, she said. Even if the chain was cut, it was probably done as a prank by some kid from town. They must hate us tourists for overrunning their village. Nancy looked skeptical. But tourists also provide jobs for their parents. I don't think they mind us that much. Look, I don't know why the sign fell, Rachel said earnestly, but I'm sure it's nothing. Nancy bit her lip. In her experience, people acted scared when they told someone was out to hurt them. Why didn't Rachel care? Nancy flashed the note she found. I found this lying on the ground where you fell, Rachel. Rachel glanced at the scrap of paper. Her face hardened. Never saw it, she claimed. Yet Nancy thought she saw Rachel's pale skin flush beneath her freckles. Me neither, Rhonda spoke up, though Nancy hadn't asked her. Just then, another knock came on the door. Hello, it's Dr. Finney. Miss Selkirk? You better go now, Nancy, Rhonda said firmly. See you tomorrow. And Nancy had no choice but to walk out. I never eat this much for breakfast, Bess exclaimed, rising from the table. Eggs, bacon, toast, and those yummy fried tomatoes. You were hungry. And no wonder you spent all day yesterday exercising, George said. Today will be more of the same. That's why I had 2 bowls of oatmeal, so I can keep up with Rhonda. Nancy wrinkled her nose. I'm not sure Rhonda will agree to ride with you today. Or Rachel with me, she said. Not after I spilled the beans to them last night. What was I thinking? You were thinking they'd be glad to know you're a detective, Bess consoled her. And anyone else would be. I think their reaction is highly suspicious. Nancy smiled, grateful for her friend's loyal support. Well, we should ride together today and enjoy ourselves. I'll go find Bob and get our map and cell phone. Meet you by the bikes, Bess agreed. Stepping outside, Nancy marveled at another sunny day. So much for all the Irish trains, she said to herself. The tour group's bikes were lined up along a low stone wall, their chrome fittings glinting in the morning sun. None of the other cyclists were out yet. Nancy strolled to the corner of the hotel to check if Bob was anywhere nearby. Rounding the corner of the white stucco inn, Nancy glanced down a narrow alley where a few cars were parked. 2 people huddled together about 50 yards down the alley in close conversation. Nancy froze. It was Rhonda, whispering earnestly with the stranger in the black overcoat. And now we're on Chapter 6, Look Both Ways. With long, determined strides, Nancy headed toward Rhonda and the mysterious man. Something's up with those 2, she told herself, and I'm going to find out what it is. But as soon as she began to approach, the man saw her from the corner of his eye and immediately started to back away from Rhonda. He raised his voice, and Nancy clearly heard him say, Thank you, miss. I'll find it on me own. I'll bet that was for my benefit, Nancy thought. Moving with surprising agility for such a large person, the man whisked around a corner before Nancy reached Rhonda. The Australian girl turned to face Nancy, looking startled. Why, Nancy, she said, adjusting the zipper on her neon green spandex jersey. G'day. Ready for today's ride? Nancy refused to be distracted. Who is that man you were talking to? Everything okay? She asked. Rhonda pursed her lips. What man? The man in the black coat, Nancy said, her fists on her hips. How should I know? Rhonda replied with an airy shrug. He was just a tourist asking for directions. He took me for a local. Fancy that! I told him I was probably just as lost as he was. Lost? Nancy narrowed her eyes. This is a small village. How could anyone be lost here? Well, he got mixed up. Didn't know which pub was which, I reckon, Rhonda explained, waving her hand. She turned on her heel and started to hurry away. Unfortunately for Rhonda, the cleats on her cycling shoes clattered and slid on the cobblestone street. Nancy, wearing her low-tech cross trainers, easily caught up as Rhonda headed for the main street. The funny thing is, I've seen that man before, she persisted, closely observing Rhonda's expression. The day we landed at Shannon Airport. I remember noticing him because he's missing one finger. Is that so? Rhonda's face was like a mask of total unconcern. I didn't get that close a look. You've got a knack for identifying people. Must be your detective eyes. Yes, Nancy said, ignoring the dig. But don't you think it's strange he would show up here? That can't be another coincidence. Why not? Rhonda said calmly, walking up on the street. Ireland's an awfully small country, and this is one of its most popular tourist spots. I reckon half the people who came through Shannon the other day will be driving up and down this coast. It's no surprise you'd run into someone twice. I wouldn't worry about it. Now excuse me, I've got to buy some film for my camera. She popped into a small shop that was open early, leaving Nancy alone on the cobbled pavement. Frustrated, Nancy went back to where the bikes were parked beside the inn entrance. Bess and George were packing supplies for the day's ride in their canvas panniers. Bags fitted onto a bracket mounted over the rear wheels. Bob gave us her map and cell phone, Bess told Nancy. We can get going whenever you're ready. Maybe if we get a head start on the others, we won't have to ride so fast. Nancy chewed her lip for a second. Her natural desire to help people was winning out over her stung sense of pride. Slight change in plans, she announced. I think we should do everything we can to follow the Selkirks again today. Bess groaned and sagged against the stone wall. Why? You'll never guess who I just saw, Nancy explained quietly, hoping none of the other gathering tour members would overhear. Remember that suspicious guy I noticed at the airport? Bess raised her eyebrows. The one with the missing finger? Yes, Nancy said, and guess who was talking to him? Rhonda. George whistled softly. She said he was just asking directions, Nancy added, but the way they were talking sure looked like they knew each other well. George glanced around to look for the Selkirks. Once again, Rhonda pretends not to know something she obviously does know, she muttered. Nancy nodded. And it does seem significant that this guy's in town, doesn't it? Considering what happened to Rachel last night. But after that note you found, I thought it was Derek who lured Rachel outside, Bess said. Ooh, do I detect a change of heart, George needled Bess? You're not defending Derek anymore. Could it be because he spent all last night flirting with both Rhonda and Rachel? Bess blushed slightly, but she held her ground. Working with Nancy, I've learned one thing. Don't ignore the evidence. Nancy pushed up the sleeves of her yellow windbreaker. I wish we knew whether the note was for Rhonda or Rachel. I had a thought in the middle of the night, George said. Suppose Derek passed the note to Rhonda and Rachel saw it. Maybe she went outside to stop Derek from having a private date with her sister. Or Rhonda went outside to stop Rachel from meeting Derek, Bess said. The possibilities in this love triangle are endless. At that moment, Derek and Camilla strolled out of the inn. As Camilla pulled on a pair of stretchy leather cycling gloves, Derek walked behind, his hands resting on her shoulders. Camilla halted for a moment and leaned back against his chest, smiling warmly up at him. They look lovey-dovey this morning, Nancy observed. Isn't it weird that Camilla doesn't seem to mind Derek flirting with the Selkirks? She fit her helmet over her hair. This isn't just a love triangle. It's a love quadrangle. Something's definitely weird. Now Rachel appeared at the inn doorway, pausing for a moment on the flagstaff to draw in a lungful of breezy sea air. She had a strip of gauze around her head, half covering her copper-colored hair, but she was decked out in full cycling gear, black and fluorescent orange. Nancy had to admire the Australian girl's spirit, even though she did question her judgment. Hey Rachel, how's the head? Natalie DeFusco called over in a friendly voice. Rachel smiled shyly and touched her bandage. I'm feeling super, I really am, she replied. It takes more than a little knock on the head to put me out of action. The bandage is just so my helmet won't irritate the cut, but the doctor says I'm perfectly fit to ride. Bob Prendergast turned around from where he was discussing the day's route with Carl Thompson. I know the doctor gave you a clean bill of health, Rachel, he said, but could you promise to take it easy today, just so I don't have a heart attack? Rachel chuckled. Anything for you, Bob. Then take the inland route instead of the coastal one, Bob advised, pointing to two different roads on the photocopied map. It's 5 miles shorter and a lot less hilly. You're riding on a rocky plateau instead of up and down seaside bluffs. Besides, it's more interesting scenery. Whatever you say, Rachel agreed. As Rachel strolled toward her bike, Nancy stepped forward. Morning, Rachel, she said. Rachel shot her a wary glance. Morning, Nancy. Hi, George and Bess. Inwardly, Nancy groaned. Telling the Selkirks that she was a detective hadn't helped her get close to them, as she had hoped. In fact, it had driven them away. Luckily, George was thinking fast. Looks like Rhonda's not here yet, she said brightly. Want to ride together this morning, Rachel? That way I can compare your speed with your sister's. Evidently, George had pushed the right button. A competitive gleam lit up in Rachel's face. I did promise Bob I'd go easy, she said with a mischievous smile, but a challenge is a challenge. Let's go. Nancy flashed a look of gratitude at her friend. With a wink, George took her 10 speed by the handlebars and walked it over to where Rachel was getting her magenta bike ready. What about Rhonda? Bess asked Nancy, craning her neck to look around. She still hasn't shown up. Are you going to try to ride with her? Nancy shook her head. I don't think she'd let me, judging from how she talked to me this morning, she sighed. She suspected she would like Rachel and Rhonda, if she ever got to know them better. Now, that didn't look likely. No, Nancy decided. If we want to keep an eye on Rhonda, we'll just have to ride close behind her. Bess made a face. And here I was looking forward to a leisurely day of cycling. I guess this means we won't be able to take another shorter inland route. Sorry, pal, Nancy said, playfully bumping her friend's arm with her fist. If Rhonda takes the coast road, and I bet she will, we've got to follow. Across the paved area, Nancy saw Rachel swing her left leg over the crossbar of her bike. George thrust her feet in the toe clips on her pedals. See you at lunch, George called out with a wave to Nancy and Bess. Bumping over the cobblestones, Rachel darted onto the main road, inserting herself into traffic right behind a small green car. George stood on her pedals, pumping to catch up. George turned onto the road, eyes trained on Rachel, who was already picking up speed. Suddenly, the torched cherry-red van roared out of the side alley. Terry O'Leary was at the wheel. He gunned the van, lurching onto the road, aiming for George. And that brings us to Chapter 7, A Vicious Cycle. Scared by the engine's roar behind her, George clutched her brakes and wrenched the bike aside. Nancy dropped her bike and ran towards George. For a moment, Nancy lost sight of her friend as the van screeched between them. Suddenly, Nancy heard a sickening thud. The van jerked to a stop. Terry O'Leary threw open his door. What is it now? He grumbled. Nancy ran around the corner of the van, Bess at her heels. George sat on the pavement looking dazed. Now I know why cyclists wear helmets, George said, looking up at her friends. I flew over the handlebars and landed on my head, but I'm actually fine. Terry stood behind Nancy, awkwardly opening and closing his fists. You want to watch where you're riding, he said to George. You can't just go barging into oncoming traffic. Bob came bustling around the van, looking agitated. Terry, you idiot, he lashed out at his driver. How many times do I have to tell you? Coming out of that alley, I couldn't see her, Terry protested, his pale gray eyes shifting nervously. Then that's when you should drive slowly, Bob said, sounding exasperated. But I had to accelerate to get up the incline. There were cars coming, Terry defended himself. Yeah, right, the dreaded rush hour traffic in Doolin, Bob muttered sarcastically. Are you okay, George? A little shaken, that's all, she said, standing up and brushing off her blue cycling shorts. A scrape on my leg, maybe. She scratched the paint, Terry complained, pointing to the side of the red van. And after we just got a new paint job. Bob groaned. Terry, forget the paint. One of our guests got hurt, and it could have been a lot worse. Now shut up and give me the first aid kit. Terry flashed a dark look at Bob and hurried to the passenger door. He handed Nancy a flat metal box with a red cross on the lid. Inside, Nancy found some alcohol and a cotton pad. She began to swab George's scraped knee clean. Where's Rachel? George asked. She went on riding. She didn't even see her collision, Bess reported. Rhonda showed up and went to catch up with Rachel. So much for riding with them, George said with a sigh. It doesn't matter, Nancy said, repacking the first aid kit. She glanced over at Terry and Bob, standing a short distance away. Bob was talking angrily. Terry hung his head and listened with a smoldering look on his face. I wouldn't be in Terry's shoes now for anything, Bess said sympathetically. Nancy crooked an eyebrow. Maybe, but it looks like Bob has read in the riot act plenty of times before. There's some bad history between them. Wish I knew what it was. Bess followed Nancy's gaze. You don't think Terry's up to something, do you? Nancy considered. Well, it was Terry who spilled that suspicious soda 2 nights ago. And last night he was close by when the sign fell on Rachel. George shivered. You don't think Terry was trying to hit me just now, do you? It happened so fast. I'm not sure what I saw, Nancy admitted. But something about this guy doesn't add up. Knowing that George wasn't really hurt, the rest of the group soon mounted their bikes and set off. Nancy, Bess, and George followed. The 3 girls soon passed the DeFuscos, then Derek and Camilla, who were dawdling along. Before long, they reached a fork. We got a late start. Might as well take the shortcut, Nancy said, turning onto the road heading inland. Yes, Bess pumped her arm. Rhonda and Rachel probably followed the coast road, George guessed. Don't bet on it, Nancy said, peering along the road ahead. I see 2 tiny figures way ahead. They're far away, but one of them is bright green and the other one orange. And if I remember correctly, Rachel was definitely wearing orange this morning, Beth said, and Rhonda was in green. Nancy grinned. Ready to kick it up a notch? Bess groaned, but Nancy and George began to pedal hard, and she had no choice but to keep up. They're leading a stiff pace, Nancy called out. So much for Rachel taking it easy. It's a good thing they didn't notice we're behind them, George shouted. Yeah, I'd hate to see how hard they'd ride if they were trying to go fast, panted Bess. Hey, they just pulled over to the side of the road, George said. Now we can catch up. Why did they stop? Nancy wondered aloud. Looks like they're checking out that herd of sheep, George guessed. Flock of sheep, Bess corrected her cousin, leaning over her handlebars. Cows go in herds, sheep are in flocks. Aren't they fluffy and adorable? I can't wait to see them up close. Uh-oh, Nancy began to reach for her handbrakes. We may be more up close than we want. The gray asphalt ahead was slowly covered by white as the immense flock of sheep began to wander onto the road. A chorus of baas rose on the air, echoing off the grassy hollows. Slow down, they're blocking the road, George called out. As Nancy pressed her handbrakes, she gazed past the sheep. Rhonda and Rachel had hopped back onto their bikes and were pedaling away. Rachel waved jauntily over her head at Nancy and her friends, stranded amidst the woolly flood. "Do you think they did that on purpose?" Nancy asked as she stopped, helpless, surrounded by sheep. The animal's fat sides heaved under the thick ivory-colored fleeces. Tiny black hooves clicked aimlessly on the pavement. "I didn't realize how many there were," Bess said, glancing skittishly from side to side. "This is creepy. How long do you think it'll take them to cross the road?" "They aren't exactly crossing," George said, frowning. "There's no dog or shepherd guiding them. They're just crashing around like bumper cars." "I bet Rhonda and Rachel opened that gate," Nancy said, pointing towards a swinging wicket at the edge of the nearby pasture. "They lured them onto the road to stop us." Looking back up the road, Nancy saw a pair of cyclists approach. It was Derek and Camilla. Nancy grimaced, embarrassed. As the English pair coasted up, Bess waved to them. "Looks like Rhonda and Rachel let these sheep out," she called out. "And now we're stuck." "Trust a pair of Australians to know about sheep," Derek said with an amused smirk. "But don't worry, we'll help you herd them back." It took some doing, but 15 minutes later, they had stirred the sheep back into the pasture. Derek fastened the gate shut. "The Selkirks got you this time," he teased. Nancy gave a rueful shrug. "Let's just head on to lunch." At the crest of the next steep hill, they looked down the hillside, expecting to see the vivid green expanses they had become used to. George braked to a stop. "Wow, what happened?" The others braked too. Below them stretched a vast panorama of creased, craggy gray rock. Bess shivered. "I feel like we just took a wrong turn and ended up on the moon." "Amazing," Nancy exclaimed. "I've never seen a landscape quite like this." "This must be what they call the Burren," Derek read from the map. George pointed downhill. "Look, there's Carl. Let's catch up to him." "You go on. I want to snap some photos," Derek said, pulling his camera out of its case. As Nancy and her friends waved goodbye and pedaled on, something struck Nancy. Odd, she thought. A panoramic lens would be the thing to catch this wide landscape. So why does Derek have that huge telephoto lens on his camera? That's like what cops use on a stakeout. Carl Thompson had parked his bike by the side of the road. It was kneeling on the gray rock. "We didn't see you pass us earlier," Bess remarked as they reached the professor. Carl looked up and grinned. "I didn't. I left early while you were all still at breakfast. I wanted to give myself plenty of time to explore the Burren. It's the main thing I came here to see. As a geologist, I find it fascinating." "Geologist? I thought you were a chemist," Bess said. Carl smiled modestly. "Double specialty." "Well, I find it fascinating too, and I'm neither a geologist nor a chemist," said Nancy. "What kind of rock is it?" George asked. "Limestone mostly," Carl said. "This kind of region is called karst. You see how it is heaved over the centuries? That's what caused all these cracks and fissures in the surface. Or, as the locals call it, the pavements. Now look inside the fissures. You'll see a whole secret world." The girls dismounted, and Bess poked a finger into one crevice. "You don't expect tiny people to be living there." George punched her cousin's shoulder. "No leprechaun sighting, Bess, please." "It's a beautiful place," Nancy said, sitting on her heels and gazing around in awe. "So primitive looking." Carl nodded. The Selkirks said it reminded them of the outback, except, of course, that the rock there is red sandstone and not gray limestone. Nancy raised her eyebrows. "The Selkirks? When did they come by?" "About 10 minutes ago," Carl said. "They stopped to look at it with me, too." Nancy got up, peering along the road ahead. There was no sign of the sisters, but they could be hidden in a road dip. "Well, thanks so much for the info," she said. "We'd better get moving." "See you at lunch. We're stopping at the Cave of Awi," Carl said, "carved by an underground river out of limestone." "Fascinating." Bess and George remounted their bikes, too, saying goodbye to the professor. They hadn't gone far before George said, "There they are!" Two tiny figures, one in neon green, the other in fluorescent orange, were outlined against the horizon, scooting briskly along. Sunlight glinted off their magenta bikes. Bess moaned. "They're so far ahead. How can we possibly catch up?" "They probably think we're still back with the sheep," Nancy reasoned. "That'll buy us some time." She stood up on her pedals and began to pump hard. From the top of the plateau, Nancy saw the scene unfold like an old silent movie. As the Selkirks coasted down a long hill, a blue car turned onto the road. As soon as the sisters passed it, it began to pick up speed. Nancy tensed up, clutching her handlebars. However fast the Selkirks might be riding, the blue car was going faster. The Australian shifted to the left, giving the car room to pass. And instead of swerving around them, the car kept bearing down toward them. Rachel glanced over her shoulder, balancing on the rim of the asphalt. Bess let out an anguished cry. Bess let out an anguished cry. That car's going to run them off the road. Excuse me. Alright, and now we're on our final chapter of the day. Chapter 8, Chase is on. The blue car surged towards the Selkirk girls. The screech of its tires ominously carried across the high, still air to Nancy, Bess, and George. As if in slow motion, Nancy saw the car ram the rear wheel of Rachel's bike. Nancy squinted to try and see a bit better. Rachel, looking like a mere flicker of orange, flipped off the road and into a ditch. Twisting around in her seat, Rhonda let out a scream, tiny and futile sounding at this distance. She bailed out, leaping off her bike just before the car reached her. She tumbled into the same ditch where Rachel had landed. The blue car, without a pause, revved up and sped away. "Come on, we've got to help," Nancy cried. The Three River Heights girls began to race their bikes down the long, winding road. "Did you get a good look at that car?" George asked Nancy as they rode abreast. Nancy shook her head. "Too far off. No way I could get a license number. I couldn't even identify the make. I don't know European models as well as I do American ones." Dropping into a ditch in the road, the girls briefly lost sight of the Selkirks. But when they came out again, they saw Rhonda and Rachel climbing out of the ditch, brushing themselves off. "They don't look badly hurt," Bess shouted, relieved. Just then, Nancy heard another car engine roar behind them. She swerved sharply behind George to let it pass, almost crashing into Bess. Looking over her shoulder, Nancy saw it was the red McElhaney Tours van. Terry O'Leary was bent over the steering wheel, jaw jutting forward, glaring at the highway. He beeped the horn and raced by, evidently headed for Rachel and Rhonda. "That was convenient, wasn't it?" George said, slackening her pace. "Too convenient," Nancy said. "How did he know they'd had an accident? Let's hurry." "Why?" Bess pleaded. "Now that help has arrived." "How do we know Terry will help?" Nancy answered. "He almost hit George this morning, remember? I don't want to leave him alone with Rhonda and Rachel." Nancy whizzed down the hill, soon pulling up to the accident site. Rhonda and Rachel sat slumped by the roadside, near where Terry had parked the van. Terry was hiking up out of the steep ditch, holding his aloft and magenta bike. "This one's got a bent wheel," he announced. I'll have to go into Galway to get it replaced. You can ride along in the van, but you'll have to skip the cave." He blinked, his eyes sliding from one of the sisters to the other. "Which one of you belongs to this bike?" Rhonda and Rachel traded glances. "It's mine," Rhonda said, climbing to her feet. She winced as she tried to rotate her shoulder. "I don't mind missing the cave. I feel a little banged up anyway. Must have landed funny." Rachel looked past Terry. "Hello, Nancy," she greeted her. "Glad to see you. Thanks for phoning Terry to come get us." "I didn't phone Terry," Nancy said, feeling guilty that the idea hadn't occurred to her. They heard a whir of wheels behind them. "It wasn't her, it was me," Carl Thompson announced, pulling up. "Derek and Camilla and I saw you from up the hill." Nancy twisted around and looked up the hill. Derek and Camilla sat on their bikes at the summit, and Derek was peering through his telephoto lens. Nancy winced, remembering Derek pointed his camera at Rhonda after she first passed out that first night. Did the guy have no sense of shame? "Well, thanks a million, Carl," Rachel said. Terry carried the bike with the bent wheel to the van. As the sun shone on its handlebars, Nancy noticed that they were covered in silver tape. "Funny," she mused. "I thought it was Rachel who put silver tape on her handlebars, not Rhonda." "Should one of us go along with you?" Nancy offered. The idea of leaving Rhonda alone with Terry worried her. Nancy thought she saw Rhonda stiffen. But before she could say anything, Terry whirled around, glaring at her. "No," he barked. "No room. I've got a whole lot of baggage back there, and all the lunch as well. I barely have room for one bike and a passenger." Rachel stood up, flexing a bruised leg. "I'm happy to ride on to the cave. It's not too much farther. I hear it's a beaut, with an underground waterfall and all." "I'll get a doctor to look at your sister," Terry grumbled. He slammed the van's back door and stomped to the driver's side. "Enjoy the cave, Rach," Rhonda said to her sister with a wink as she climbed into the van. "Feel better," Rachel replied. Nancy anxiously watched the van pull away, hoping that Rhonda would be safe. The van left, and the 5 cyclists, Nancy, Bess, George, Rachel, and Carl, got back onto their bikes. "I owe you girls an apology," Rachel said as they reached cruising speed. "That was a sneaky trick Rhonda and I played on you with the sheep." "What trick?" Carl asked. Bess rolled her eyes. "We got stuck in the middle of a flock of sheep crossing the road." Carl chuckled. "That must have been an experience." "It was," Nancy agreed. "Well, I appreciate the apology, Rachel. Rhonda and I saw them milling around by the gate and couldn't resist," Rachel confessed. "Especially since you 3 seemed so keen to catch up with us. It was just a prank." "Unfortunately, that incident with the car wasn't just a prank," Nancy said, still concerned about Rhonda's departure. "We saw it all from a distance. Did you recognize that car?" "Recognize it?" Rachel looked puzzled. "No way. I don't know anybody in Ireland. Anyway, I never got to go look at the car. It was behind me the whole time." "You know, it looked like the car hit your bike," Nancy said. "Rhonda only jumped off hers, yet her wheel was bent, not yours. Isn't that strange?" Rachel bit her lip. "Well, actually, it was my bike that got hurt. Rhonda said it was hers because she knew I wanted to go see the cave." Nancy nodded. That explained the silver handlebar tape. But she wondered grimly if Rhonda had bought more trouble than she knew. One thing Nancy had to say: the car accident had changed Rachel's attitude. She no longer seemed intent on ditching Nancy. They hung out together for the next couple of hours, enjoying their picnic lunch and then exploring the cave of Aui. Though the underground cavern was illuminated, there were plenty of shadowy corners and eerie echoes. At one point, a simple drip of water off the stalactite made Rachel jump, and her foot slipped on a clammy cavern floor. Nancy grabbed her elbow just in time. Rachel flashed her a smile of gratitude. "Maybe Rachel has realized it's good to be with a detective," Nancy thought to herself, "especially when so many dangerous things have happened, coincidence or not." When they emerged from the cavern, blinking in the afternoon sunlight, Terry was waiting in the parking lot with the red van. He had already collected the bikes and had returned to drive the cyclists to Galway City. "There's not enough seats for everybody to ride at once. We'll have to make 2 trips, Bob explained. "I'll go on the second shift," Derek volunteered. "Rachel, why don't you sit with me?" Nancy noticed Camilla standing behind Derek, giving him a little jab in the ribs. Good for you, Nancy thought. Rachel hesitated. "Actually, Derek, I'd like to get to Galway and make sure Rhonda's okay." "I saw her at the hotel. Everything's fine," Bob assured Rachel. "She had a soak in a hot bath, and she's feeling 100%. Nancy blew a tiny sigh of relief. "I could use a hot bath," Natalie DeFusco put in. "I call first shift." Nancy, Bess, and George agreed to ride with Derek and Camilla on the second trip. After the first group had driven away, Derek and Camilla strolled around the grounds. "Look, Camilla's giving Derek a piece of her mind," George noted dryly, nodding to where the English pair were having a heated conversation. "It's about time," Bess said. "Even I'm tired of the way he throws himself at the Selkirks." "Jealous?" George asked. "Not anymore," Bess said. "He may be totally hot-looking, but who wants a boyfriend who flirts with other girls?" "Do you still think he's behind all those accidents?" George asked Nancy. Nancy cupped her chin in her hand. "I don't know. He couldn't have been driving the blue car. He was riding along with us." "It wasn't Terry O'Leary either. He showed up in the van soon after," Bess pointed out. Nancy nodded. "But Terry could be working with the driver of the blue car," she suggested. "We know he was somewhere nearby, since he arrived so fast. And he sure was eager to take Rhonda away in the van. Thank goodness she got back okay." "One thing occurs to me," George said. "What if all these incidents are aimed at the McLeany Tours itself? It could be sabotage from a rival company. That falling sign and the poisoned soda might have been aimed at anybody. And it was me who got hit by the van this morning." "Yes, but you were right behind Rachel," Bess pointed out. "It could have hit you by mistake." "Well, it is a theory," Nancy said, "but 3 out of 4 incidents so far have involved the Selkirk sisters. I'm afraid we'll have to see what happens next, if anything." Terry and Bob soon returned, and the 5 remaining tour members piled into the red van. The drive around the bay didn't take long. Soon they were sweeping down into Galway City. The girls sat up eagerly looking out the van windows. Bob slid forward on his seat to deliver his usual travelogue. "Lots of people think Galway City is Ireland's prettiest city," he said. "The downtown area is remarkably well preserved and quaint, but there's a university here and lots of arts and culture. In its heyday as a port, Galway had a thriving trade with Spain. It said that Christopher Columbus made his last stop here on his way to America. In the 16th century, Nancy leaned back and let Bob's words wash over her. It would be nice to be in a city again for a night, she decided. She enjoyed riding from village to village, but her legs weren't used to so much exercise, especially not at the speed she had to ride to keep up with the Selkirks. Nancy must have dropped off, because the next thing she knew, George was shaking her awake. Nancy, we're here. Bess is going up to the room. I want to check out this cool pottery store I noticed as we were riding into town. Nancy shook herself. Pottery? I'm up for that. She climbed out of the van and followed George down the sidewalk from the hotel. The girls plunged into the narrow medieval streets of downtown Galway City. Like a maze, the streets twisted and wound between overhanging old buildings. This is so cool, Nancy exclaimed. Here's the shop, George announced. She marched into a quaint-looking shop front with tiny windows. Inside, however, was a well-lit, modern store, its open display shelves lined with beautiful hand-thrown pieces of glazed ceramics by local artists. Browsing among the shelves, Nancy reached out to touch one bowl. It would have made a perfect gift for Hannah Gruen, the housekeeper who had cared for Nancy ever since Nancy's mother died. Nancy lifted the bowl gently, admiring its smooth, greenish glaze and sinuous curves. A man's hand was reaching into the case from the other side to grasp a mug. His coat sleeve was heavy black wool, and the little finger was missing from his left hand. Alright, and on that cliffhanger, we're going to wait until tomorrow and we'll pick up with chapter 9. Again, thank you everybody for listening. Hope you have a great day and stay safe. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.